Hello, I am Kathy Callahan Howe of the Justice Network of the Free Methodist Church, and this is the first in our August series of Race and Justice, a Deep Dive. And we are very honored today to have with us the Reverend Jeffrey Harrold. Jeff is the pastor, the founding pastor, and now the senior pastor of the New Beginnings Community Church of Washtenaw County, and that's in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Jeff is bivocational, so he also is the coordinator for academic standards and special populations and a member of the Academic Standards Board in the University of Michigan Ann Arbor's College of Literature, Science, and Arts. And just to give you a feel for why he is qualified for today's subject, he's been trained in social justice mediation. He's a qualified administrator for the Intercultural Development Inventory. He was trained to hold restorative conferences by the International Institute for Restorative Practices. Besides his pastoral duties and those positions, he's also a founding member of the Washtenaw Regional Organizing Coalition and a founding member of the Washtenaw Faith Leaders Forum, which is a group of the county faith leaders who come together to proactively address the issue of police and community interaction in his community. He also serves as a chaplain for the Sigma Rho graduate chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. He's been married to his amazing wife, Monica, for 39 years, and they have a wonderful partnership together. She's a valuable part of his team. He's also been previously the director of the African Heritage Network and has been very involved there. We were doing some calculating, so Jeff has been a Free Methodist since 1991. He had attended Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and was already ordained as an elder in the Methodist Episcopal Church. So he
African Methodist Episcopal.
Sorry, I said it wrong. African Methodist Episcopal Church. I always call it the AME, but I was trying to give the whole name and I messed up, so I apologize for that. So he transferred in as an elder. And as far as we know, he has the longest tenure of any of our African American pastors. He's been in his church this whole time. So we're excited to have him here today, and we were going to gain his perspective on the church and on systemic racism. So we're going to start really simple, Jeff. What is systemic racism?
So when you think of systemic racism, think of systems, something that is held together deliberately. It's held together by parts that reinforce it. So we think of systems like transportation systems that have connecting units to it, right? There's a shipping transportation that arrives at let's say the Port of Long Beach, and it is picked up by a overland trucking transportation that now takes it maybe to a terminal where there's air transportation. And we understand systems like that. When you talk about systemic racism, you're not just talking about bigotry, and you're not just talking about prejudice. You're talking about a system of laws and policies that reinforce and enforce racist practices and ideas. And so when you think of systemic racism, you need to think of racism and bigotry with power, because there is a system that reinforces the racist ideas.
So how does that present itself? What does that look like in everyday life for us? What are we looking for if we want to understand that better?
So when you're looking for systemic racism, I think that first you need to understand that it exists. And so we can go as far back as the slave codes of the 1600s in Virginia. And so we had slavery. Slavery needed some enforcement, and it kept running up against laws that invalidated parts of it. And so if you had a slaveholder that had sexual relations with his slave, had a rape with his slave, power dynamics of force or rape, then the child was free because the children of Englishmen were free. Well, that be the center of the problem. So, okay, had to, do something about that. So in 1662, they changed it and said, well, actually the freedom of the child comes from the mother. And so since the mother is now a slave, the child can be a slave. And so that went along, and it was okay until missionaries started saying, well, we want to preach the gospel to the slave. Well, wait a minute, but Christians are free. So, well, okay, I tell you what, why don't we do this? So in 1667, let's change the law again to say that baptism does not make a slave free. So missionaries, you are free to do your work because it's not going to change the slave status. And then when you had punishment of slaves, okay, so what if I kill my slave? I mean, killing is murder, right? Well, then you get to the 1669 Virginia Slave Code that says, well, actually not, because see, slavery is property and you can't kill your property. And so you can't have premeditated murder because nobody would deliberately destroy their own property. And so you have those things going until you begin to really codify it in the United States Constitution. And so in the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, basically says that it's the first Fugitive Slave Act, that if a slave goes to another state, its owner has the right to go get that slave, and that slave has to send that slave back to its owner. And we have more slave laws, acts to come up, one in 1793, and then you have one in 1850. And when I talked earlier about racism as racial policies with power, in the 1793 Slave Act, if you were found to harbor a slave, so we like to talk about the Free Methodist abolitionists, right? If you were found to harbor a slave, not only did the slave have to go back, but the person harboring the slave was fined $500. Now, to give you a sense of what that is, the present value of $500 from 1793 today is 13 grand. And so if you want to participate in the Underground Railroad, you were more than happy to. But if we caught you, right, for each act, you were going to kick out 13 grand. This is where you get the sense of systems. And so that becomes the whole framework of what we have. We go from subjugation in the slave codes and the Fugitive Slave Act and slavery. And by the way, that article in the Constitution was eliminated by the 13th Amendment, almost, because in the 13th Amendment, it said you can't have slavery except in involuntary servitude, except in issues of imprisonment. And so you went from subjugation to segregation. And so now what you did was you began to criminalize Black behavior, or you began to round up Black men for being vagrants, not paying their debts or whatever, sending them to slave farms. And now you became involuntary servitude. And people say, well, that was then, but well, then when that ended, you replaced that with segregation. And so then you had segregation and you had segregated laws. And I did an interracial marriage of a couple. And they celebrate Loving Day. Now, some of us may have never heard of Loving Day, and to be honest with you, I had never heard of Loving Day. But Loving Day basically is the celebration of the day that Mildred Loving and her husband won this landmark civil rights decision, saying that, and I believe this was in 1967, that interracial couples can legally get married because you could be in prison up to a year for an interracial marriage. And so we got to segregation, and then we get to incarceration. And so Michelle Alexander, in her masterful book, The New Jim Crow, talks about how now you begin to use mass incarceration to arrest folks. And so if we look at systemic racism today, all we need to do is look at our prison system. Someone has said that it's 70 years after the end of concentration camps. You looked at Germany, and you saw that 60% of the population of the German prisons were filled with Jews, you would say, okay, something's wrong with this system going on here. And when we look at the prison system in America today, we see a continuation of that systemic racism going on. And it works its way out into housing, it works its way out into employment, it works its way out into education. But it's not just haphazard, it's intentional.
So Jeff, kind of what you've described is the bar keeps getting moved. So back when the law said, if your mom is or your dad is free, then you're free. They're like, oops,
Right.
let's fix that. And so
Right.
continually just moving the bar forward. And then after slaves were freed, and yet incarceration was an exception. So then there were laws against you had to work, and yet there were no jobs. And so it was just like this cycle that keeps moving. And then
Exactly.
incarceration today, and some people say, well, those people probably did something or they wouldn't be in jail. And yet there's a discrepancy between sentencing and between the proportion of African Americans in jail and in the community. What are some other things now? So incarceration was one example of what's going on right now. Can you give another example of current outbreaks of systemic racism and how it affects people still?
So one thing that is blaringly there is education. So we know that the schools are predominantly Black and brown and poor kids are under-resourced. I work at a university, one of the best public universities in the world, and advanced placement classes are highly valued. The rigor of your advanced placement class can boost your GPA. Well, if you're in a school without advanced placement classes, it then disadvantages you. And so in a corrective mode, universities have gone to the steps of saying, we're just going to do away with AP credit as an admissions criteria. In fact, some students in Compton, California, maybe about 10 years ago, sued the California system, saying that we don't have AP classes in our schools. And you use AP classes for admissions, and therefore we're disadvantaged. And so although we had Brown versus Board of Education that supposedly desegregated schools, we're watching now, the schools are getting more and more segregated in the attempt to, let's say we're making better education. We're coming up with public charter schools, but a lot of public charter schools are segregating. And so you can find in education, you can find it in employment. It used to be you could do a class action suit. It seems like no African Americans are being promoted within this whole company of 300,000 people. And you might be able to do a class action suit until the Supreme Court said, well, actually, each of you have to prove that you were individually discriminated against before you can bring suit. Well, okay, so then it becomes, well, no, see, Jeff, he just didn't fit. And we could say, Monica, it's some qualifications, and you could come up with some things
Right.
about individuals that you can distinguish out. And housing, we're still dealing with the effects of housing. And even today, it is still harder for African Americans to access what I would call reasonable credit. So you can get credit, but you might be 10 points over prime, whereas housing prices or mortgages are 3%. You may find African Americans getting mortgages at 8%, 9%. The same thing with car loans, because they are risk factors. And if you push that into business loans, you find African American businesses being undercapitalized because they just can't get access to capital. And so you can see the systems running even today.
So we've talked about employment, incarceration, education. Also, I think the medical system, there's statistics on that. So these are all ways that systemic racism is continuing. What do we do? What does the average person do to dismantle this? What's our job?
Well, Kathy, I think that the first thing you do is you recognize it. And saying we don't see it and it is not there does not make it not there. And so our white brothers and sisters have to realize that they live in a sea of privilege. And they may not recognize it. Someone has said that fish aren't wet when they're swimming in the ocean. They're not wet, they're in the ocean. And so we may look at the systems that advantage us, and we have to intentionally examine and see what's going on. We see the evidence of what is happening. We can look at our neighborhoods and ask, why is it that it seems like there are no Black families that move on my block? Why is it that with all the folks that come into our job, we don't have African Americans or people of color in positions of high authority? I used to go over to University of Michigan Hospital, and on the second floor is the lunchroom. And the custodial staff, their uniforms used to be blue. And if you just sat right there at the entrance, you would see white coats and blue coats. And you would see a sea of white coats, technicians and doctors that were going in, overwhelmingly white, and a sea of blue coats, overwhelmingly Black. Now, if you're going to begin to really think about dismantling, you have to say to yourself, either the people in the blue coats as a group are too stupid to get into the white coats, or something is going on here that is disadvantaging this system. Mm-hmm. And so you have to look around at what's going on and really become a part of dismantling. The other thing you have to do is change the narrative, because that may be the narrative you go with. Well, obviously, they can't get access to the white coats because they just don't have what it takes. Because racism has a narrative too. Mm-hmm. Lazy, doesn't work hard enough, doesn't go for opportunities, born criminal, committed crimes, more crime committing than we do. And if you buy into the narrative and don't push back on the narrative, it will lull you to sleep, and you will basically let things stay as they are. Kind of going back to one thing that you made reference to about arrest. And one thing that Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow brings out is that the beauty of the war on crime is that it made it legal to incarcerate. And folks will look and say, look, they broke the law, and they're in jail because they broke the law. And so you may have stop and frisk in New York City. I will guarantee you, pick any white suburb, you will not have stop and frisk on them. Where you walk down the street and you walk by the local high school and you say, okay, all y'all up against the wall, and see if you have drugs. You have raids on drug houses. I get that, right? You're looking for drugs. But I work on a college campus and we have massive fraternity houses. And I'm not going to be naive to think that there is no drug use going on in those frat houses. Matter of fact, you can almost assume, you may even know drug use is going on. But I would be willing to bet money that you are never going to see a LawNet or a DEA raid on frat houses on college campuses. It's not going to happen at the University of Alabama. It's not going to happen at Michigan. It's not going to happen at Harvard. It's not going to happen at UC Berkeley. Now, if you wanted to apply the law, you could, and you could send them to prison. But you're not. And so you're going to say, well, see, we're not committing crimes, they are. Well, it's just selective enforcement.
Yes, that's, as you mentioned in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she shows charts and how the average user of marijuana is a white college student, but the sentencing and the arrests are skewed towards African Americans. So it's, again, not that white folks aren't doing it, it's just they're not being arrested and in prison for it.
Yeah,
One
a
of the
good example of that, if I can, is crack cocaine, powder cocaine. Crack cocaine is you find that in among drug users in Black communities. Powder cocaine is a wealthy white professional drug. Yet the sentencing disparities were dramatic. You could get 3 times, 4 times the time in prison for a gram of crack cocaine than you could for powder cocaine, because you'd have to start sending a whole different group of people to prison, and you weren't.
It's also the disparity of, during the crack cocaine era, we were arresting Black people, and then during the opioid crisis, we were concerned and trying to fix the problem instead of arresting people. And people have been arrested. I don't want to act like that hasn't happened, but a very different response. I also want to go back to your the stereotype that African Americans are lazy, and there's such an irony in that when they were forced to build the country. So we're looking at the race of people that were forced to work ridiculously hard, and then we flip the narrative now to say that they're lazy instead of recognizing the barriers that are
there. And again, back to narrative. So you went from the plantation to the factory, and the factories closed and folks didn't have jobs. And African Americans, the great migration from the South and North was for factory work, textiles and steel mills around Chicago, Indiana. And you had auto companies in Michigan, and folks came in mass to come work. In fact, Ypsilanti is sometimes referred to as Ypsi-Tucky, because so many folks from Kentucky came up to Ypsilanti to work in the Ford plants, and houses were built for them. And massive amounts of houses were built in Detroit for people that migrated. But when folks came and jobs were lost, and then African Americans lost jobs, and they needed assistance, it was, well, you know, they're sitting around waiting on their welfare checks. They don't want to work. I don't want to spend money for folks to give them welfare, don't want to work. And I am slightly amused that right now in this COVID environment, there are a whole bunch of folks sitting around waiting on a government check. And let me throw out there, in all honesty, there are many pastors, okay, of conservative churches that may well have felt that folks were sitting around waiting on government support, that were running like they were running to a fire sale to get their paycheck protection applications in so they can make sure they get their government check. Now, I'm not mad at them, right? Your family has to eat. The job isn't there. You need help. I'm just saying that when the factories closed and folks needed help in the hood, it was the exact same thing. Right. But the narrative changes. And so it goes from crackhead, and I'm not even going to use that pejorative use for women on crack, to people with sickness who now have to be treated for a medical condition for addiction. I'm all for it. But as we're now dealing with Narcan and other things to deal with opioid addiction, in my community, we're just asking, where was this drug for African Americans? And if now we are talking about the sickness of addiction, does that mean we're now going to go reverse the sentences of the drug addicts from poor and Black communities because we now recognize that they were sick and need to be in treatment, not in prison?
Good point. So you mentioned pastors, so I want to pull this back around to the church. So 20 years ago, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith wrote the book Divided by Faith, and in their research, they determined that in general, white Christians wanted to only focus on the gospel, whereas the Black church was also, in addition to the gospel and evangelism, concerned about social issues, social justice issues. So the premise of the Justice Network is a both and approach, that we need to not only preach the gospel, but be concerned about justice. So can you talk about that for a moment? Why, in addition to the gospel, which of course we value, should we be concerned about social justice issues as Christians?
Because God is concerned about social justice. You cannot read Jeremiah, you cannot read Ezekiel without being overwhelmed by the fact that God is constantly talking about one of the reasons that he is sending Judah into captivity is because of social justice issues. They rob the poor of their wages. They oppress the alien among them. Do we really think that God is not looking down on the church and saying that we should be doing everything we can to get children out of cages on hard floors with aluminum blankets? And it should not be the heart of everyone who calls the name of Jesus to look at a situation where kids are separated from their parents. Some of them, the records are gone and we don't even know how to find the parents. And God is not concerned about that. I think when Jesus said, suffer the little children to come unto me, he didn't mean suffer them to come unto me so you could put them into detention. And when we look at how we treat immigrants, how we treat the poor, justice is at the heart of God. And God speaks about justice. In fact, it has been said that one problem of seminaries is when we talk about systematic theology, is that part of that is that we don't have justice as a systematic theology category. And we don't talk about how that plays out. But that is a major part of our existence as folks who are to love our neighbors as ourselves. How can you do that without a just society?
Amen. So you've been a Free Methodist for 30 years. What changes have you seen in that time in the Free Methodist Church regarding these issues? What's different than it was when you came in?
Some, okay. I'm going to say there's some changes. I'm going to shock folks and I'm going to say not much. There's some, okay. As Pastor Kenny said, when he was being interviewed last week, the Board of Administration has done an incredible shift in how many folks of color are now on the BOA. And we have African American superintendents now. And that is a change. I'm not going to take that away from the church. But when we look at where we are still and how we are now moving intentionally into spaces where people of color are to begin to build churches and build ministries and do ministry and recruit folks from those areas and bring them in, that we're still not really doing a great job on. And so we haven't got to the point where we're comfortable enough as a denomination where we can take our truly itinerant ministry and send ministers of color to white congregations. I think it flows the other way. It has always flowed the other way. Howard could have gone into St. Louis as a white man, Howard Over. I don't think Kenny could have gone into Ferguson, okay, to a white church. In fact, one of the things that kind of helped me come into the Free Methodist Church was I saw 30 years ago there was some intent. And that is what intent.
Some intent.
Intent. So when I got interviewed, I was brought in to actually start an ethnic ministry, start a black church in the Southern Michigan Conference. I met with my then superintendent, Bill Kreiderman, and the head of the Board of Evangelism, Merrill Bradley, and we met in Olive Garden, and they talked to me, and I like them, they like me, and they said, okay, so Jeff, we got a question for you now. We're itinerant ministry, an itinerant church, and that means that we send pastors to churches. Are you willing to be sent? And my reply was, I'm coming from the AME Church. We're an itinerant church as well. I understand that. When you appointments, you serve at the pleasure of the bishop. Where you get sent, you go. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you have a place to send me? And they paused and looked at each other and looked at me and said, frankly, no. Now, I was impressed at least with the honesty. I loved Merrill. I loved Bill. I can say still in a big sense, there's not a lot of places where we look and see as an itinerant ministry where we can say we are now a church where we have that open flow and we can do it of people of color, of women, to any of our churches, and our people are ready to accept this Free Methodist elder, validated by the annual conference, okay, validated by the denomination. And if we can't do that yet, 150 plus years in, 30 years almost from when I started, if that's not something that we can do, I can say, yeah, we made some, but we got a long way to go.
Yes, Kenny mentioned this because he did get appointed more recently, before his current appointment, to the John Wesley Church. So that was progress. But I was interested as well, you may have seen now Bishop Emeritus David Roller wrote something about this, and he mentioned exactly what you just said, that basically people that were, people of color or women often were not appointed to churches where they would have fit because of the reluctance of the congregation. And it kind of goes back to what you said earlier about the narrative. No one said, oh, they don't want a black person or they don't want a woman. It would be like, oh, it's not a good fit. It was always, a vague reference without just coming right out and saying it. And he was saying he regretted being part of that and not pushing harder. And so, that's one of the positive things about, I think, where we're headed, hopefully with our new bishops and new initiatives to try to do that, to be more open to allowing pastors to pastor in different situations. So that's a great example of a system that needs to be different. Is there anything else about the Free Methodist Church in particular? So we talked about leadership, continuing to raise up leaders of color and women, and then appointing them. Is there something else you would also mention?
I think one thing that could change is, so credentialing has been something that we've talked about and we've done and we've changed and we've brought folks in. Your outputs are often determined by your inputs, and we have requirements of what you need to do for ordination and who you need to be. When I came into the Free Methodist Church, you literally still had to sign on the dotted line that you would not drink and gamble. I'm glad we don't have to sign on the dotted line, sign contracts like that anymore. But we would look in and saying that, look, we think that there are some things we expect, and we look at our elders coming in, and there's certain things we expect. One thing that we can do is we can have some requirements, some expectation for people coming in to be committed to be anti-racist. Now that's different than being an integrationist, because I can be an integrationist and not be an anti-racist. And so there's a saying, right, about African Americans and white Americans, that in the South, white Americans don't care how close you get just so long as you don't get too high. And in the North, they don't care how high you get, just so long as you don't get too close. Okay. And so there are attitudes, there are behaviors that we can watch for, look for, to see if in this new generation of leaders, are we bringing in people committed to social justice? Are we bringing in people that are committed to dismantling anti-racism? In the Episcopal Diocese of Detroit, for the Episcopal Church, it is required that every one of their priests in training must take training in community organizing. That is a requirement because they value their priests being community organizers. And so if we value really seeing intentional change in our attitudes and in our congregations, then we will bring in leaders who have that type of commitment. And that will be something that we will look for, require, train for, help folks understand, so that not only will their preaching, but their interaction in the community and the expectations of the congregations be different. So there's some things we could do in credentialing that would be different.
So some of the things we've discussed are issues that the average person in pew can't do, or they can be involved in. They can be involved in accepting pastors that are appointed to them and that sort of thing, but they're not part of, the powers that be in the system. So what about the average lay person? Give us some examples of things they can do that help dismantle racism, both in the community and in their own church and in their systems.
So again, when you're talking about dismantling racism, you're talking about being intentional. The issue of race is all around us right now. We need to begin to seriously ask questions of why. And so if we're in communities and we're looking at our community and it seems like it stays the way it is, there's no racial diversity at all, begin to answer why. We talk to each other and we hear each other. And if we could have a hot mic at the picnic and the wedding and the Thanksgiving dinner and at dinner at night and when we're driving in the car, we would hear attitudes and behaviors of people. Now, one thing that the average person in the pew can do is be aware, acknowledge, let's say, if they are understanding that racism is in their midst, if they are an active or benign part of it, if there are systems that exist, and actively take steps to help dismantle it, whether it means who you vote for in your elections, what you require of the people that are governing you and making decisions, what goes on in your schools, how you interact with people on your jobs, the things you teach your children. I knew of a man who grew up in the South, and his father pulled him in, was a lawyer, when Brown versus Board of Education happened. He said, son, I want to tell you, this decision is right. It is right morally, and it is right legally. But when you walk outside this door, it is segregation now and segregation forever. Now, how do we change? We help our children realize when you walk outside this door, this decision is right and this decision is moral. And so we also begin to help our people learn how to be allies. We help to teach them how to push back on racism when they see it, and to understand the system that is around them. There are some things that we look at in our society, and we think that it is happenstance, when it's not. It is deliberate and it is purposeful. Some of us in the pew are on the boards that are making decisions about people of color, whether to hire them or not. And we can change it that way. And so we have people in our congregations that are people of influence. And when we decide that we want to really begin to dismantle this, we will actively not only engage in those activities that will begin to dismantle racism, but what we don't know, we'll go learn and we'll get training on. And we'll seek out answers and we'll seek out partnerships with people who are actively doing the work.
I was interested in listening lately to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, because he talked about the training. And we don't think about that a whole lot. And he talked about before they would take an action, they would pray about it, they would make a decision, is this the right thing to do? And then they would train people. They didn't just rush in there. And now I feel like, we just go out and do what we want to do without being trained. So are there some suggestions you have for people to educate themselves? What would be some good sources for training, for reading? What would you suggest?
So I would suggest one thing you do is start local, okay? Start local because you want to make your effect local. There are things you can do to add to the voices for global change. But I would say start local. In community organizing, one thing we do is we call it cutting an issue. We pick something that is local and winnable. And so climate change is not winnable locally. But getting the check your box if you're a felon off of the government application for employment, that's local and winnable because we can go to the county commissioners or the county supervisors and we can advocate for that and see that change. And so I would say there are probably organizations within your own community that are already doing anti-racist work. And join with them. Now, some folks will say, look, okay, there's other things going on and so forth. In the community organizing group I'm in right now, we don't pray. Now, some folks may be shocked with that. We don't pray. We come together. We might have a meditation that we have, but we're there to deal with these issues. Now, it's not that individually we're not praying for what's going on, but in this meeting with this group of people, if I'm dealing with folks that are dealing with issues of anti-racism that are Muslims and Jews and Buddhists, then I tell you what, let's just deal with the issue that we've got some racist policies going on in the school, and we'll go back to our church and our synagogue and our temple and we'll pray about it. But when we come together for this meeting, we're going to advocate for the issue. And that is not a sellout to the faith. It is basically, we're partnering with folks to get work done. There are podcasts. One good one is Seen White. That is a great podcast. Books galore. If you Google anti-racist, you're going to get 1,000 books. In fact, I sent some out to folks earlier this year, and I could give you the link if you want to put it on the Justice website. I think I already did. There's a publishing house that was saying that we're going to give you all of our books on anti-racism for free. You could download them. I think it was Oxford Press that did it. But books are a multitude. There are videos, like 13th, okay, that talk about the effects of the 13th Amendment. And when you hear folks talk about the discrimination and the racism that they're experiencing, believe them. Don't brush it off. Don't give it a excuse. Believe it. But look for ways that you can be involved. The same way that if we were saying, well, what do I do to get involved with climate change? I really want to get involved in the pro-life movement. Well, okay. you will find how to get involved. And there are places and entry points. And so one thing I would say, particularly to my white brothers and sisters, educate yourself. And you have to humble yourself to educate yourself. And when you educate yourself, for a long time, you'll need to sit and listen so you can hear what the issues are and understand. Don't get defensive. Okay. I would say put on your thick skin when you go, because you're going to hear some things about yourself. Realize that when you come to this understanding, it's going to cost some reassessment of the reality that you're currently dealing in. That the land of the free and the home of the brave has not been that free. And when we talk about some of the stances that we've had to take to deal with issues of social justice, quite frankly, we have not been that brave either.
I love it that you mentioned the pro-life movement, because that's something we care about. And we are willing to work across, we work with Catholics, we work with anybody who is willing to care about that. And I think of John Wesley saying, if your heart is as mine, give me your hand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great example that we can work on a justice issue, even if we don't agree on faith issues. That doesn't
Absolutely.
have to be the prerequisite. So we can care about racism, we can care about climate change, we can care about the pro-life movement across those lines that we traditionally, think we're not supposed to cross. We don't have to go to church with people to be able to work together. So that's a great example.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm also thinking about the thick skin. I'm glad you said that, because I think for white folks, it's challenging if you're going to be an ally, because there's this balance between being an ally and being supportive without taking over.
Right.
We just kind of want to come in and take over. And so you have to be willing to sit down when you're supposed to sit down, and also to mess up. And I think that's, my big message for my fellow white folks is you're going to get it wrong, and just, say I'm sorry and move on, and, learn what you messed up, learn how you stepped on somebody's toes or whatever you did that wasn't quite okay, but don't use that as an excuse to not help.
Exactly.
I think it's pretty easy sometimes to think, well, I don't want to do it wrong. And just like anything in life, whether you're learning a new skill of any kind, you're going to mess up. You're going to, I liken it a lot to speaking a new language. If you don't know Spanish and you're trying to learn, somebody's going to correct you, and you just have to take the correction and be, oh, thank you, and move on. So that's kind of what we have to do as white people, is take the rebuke, take the correction, and be willing to fix it and do better.
And when you and also be ready for the shift, because systemic racism is an issue of power and privilege based on race. And when you begin to dismantle it, you're also going to begin to see a power dynamic shift. And so the phrase is used of being at the table. Okay, I got it. But when we really have true equity and inclusion, I'm not just at the table. I get to decide where I sit at the table. And I get input as to what is being served at the table. And I get input as to what time we're going to eat dinner. And I get input into what the place settings are going to look like. Now that's a power. That's a shift in power, right? And I may decide, quite frankly, that at the table, we want to take the table outside. We want to bring it inside. And so you begin to see that the privilege of decision making, we can bring, let's say, African Americans into organizations, yet we hold the power. But when we begin to see the power shift, we're going to see dynamic shift. One thing that is that will happen is you'll see things like music. You'll see conversation. You'll even see what the topic of the sermon is. In my church, you will hear preaching on social justice. You will hear it. And when you change the dynamics of power, that you also begin to change what is valued. And so the other thing, you may see the money shift. and you will see spending shift, and you will see who's appointed shifting, and you'll see the composition shift. The Free Methodist Church has something called Open Door, and I think it was 1995. It was at the Mount Moore Street Church. That was my first time going there. And, you know, we were talking about being open, and I think I'd been in the church maybe 4 years then. And my statement was, I've liked the Free Methodist Church. They've been welcoming, okay? But I'm a light-skinned African-American. I'm fairly articulate in what I say. I may be accepted because of education and who I am. But if you take me, you take my community. You take folks of darker hue. You take folks of all education levels. You take us all. And if you're not ready to take us all, then you're not ready. And so one thing the power dynamic will do, the shift will do, is you bring in different people. And you will also begin to shift what qualifications look like, and who's in charge, and who's teaching Sunday school, and who the youth leader is. All these things will begin to take a shift. When you really begin to dismantle a system of racism built on power. And you will see when you lose power, losing power is hard to do because we benefit from power. And if the power dynamic shift, we have to be ready to go with that. Now, I'm not saying that we're looking, be ready for a takeover, but do be ready for a shift in power dynamics.
Yes, I love your analogy of the table. And what I was thinking as you were talking, and you kind of came back around to it, is that you also get to invite more people to the table.
Yes, you do.
If you have an equitable spot, then you get to invite others to join you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeff. Is there anything else that you want to unburden yourself with, that you want to share with our audience?
I want us to, yes, I do. This is a season I think God has opened up in our country, really to address an issue that has been on the table since our nation's inception, this issue of racism. And we can courageously deal with it and get it done, or we cannot and watch the forces of racism and division take the ground back. Let me not say take it back. Take the initiative, douse the fire on the initiative, and we lose it. And so what I would want to see us do is really step into this moment. Lament is fine, okay? But as the scripture says, godly sorrow leads to repentance. And true repentance is about change. It's not about words, it's about change. It is saying that it is about confession, and it is about repairing the harm that I did and moving forward. Now, in our repentance, right, we don't have to pay the price for every sin. Jesus paid the price. But when we are redeemed, we do begin to look to repair the harm we've done. And in society, in the church, in our daily lives, if we're going to dismantle racism, we need to be ready for an active, intentional engagement that goes beyond, I feel your pain. Because of that, I say thank you. Now, let's talk about how we get here and what we're going to do next. And so I'll also say this, if you're in this, you're going to push, and there's going to be pushback. And if we're really going to do this, we have to be ready to push back on the pushback. For my white brothers and sisters, get ready to get kicked out the club. Because when you stand up against the systems of power and privilege, you won't be able to go to the parties anymore. You won't get invited to the wedding. You won't get a seat at the table anymore. But that's okay if we're trying to create a new society built on justice and righteousness and equity and fairness. That's what we're called to do. Transform.
Well, we saw Jesus got kicked out of the club, right?
You got kicked out the club.
All
Absolutely.
over of its place. So that's our privilege, really, to be that person.
Absolutely. And Paul definitely got kicked out the club.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I want to encourage all of you. We have just begun our series for this month, but we also just started with our learning community using the resource Be the Bridge. So if you haven't checked that out yet, please look on our page and sign up for that. It's not too late. We're reading that resource. It's an excellent, especially if this is all new to you and you're like, okay, I hear you, but what on earth am I supposed to do about it? It's a great place to start. So look on our page, get the book, find someone to talk to about it. There are ways to sign up for that. Marissa Heffernan is in charge of that. So look for that opportunity. It's a great place to start, and keep following us. We're going to continue to share this kind of content, and we appreciate you being with us for this. So thank you so much again, Jeff. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
God bless you.
You too.